In the previous part, we have finished the pet generation. Currently, if I refresh this page, you see that we generate an animal on a random cell. We still can click it, and also we can buy a new animal. And now let's make our animals clickable, so every time when I click it, you see that my poop counter increases by 1. Also, if I have enough currency, I can buy a new animal. In our current code, we don't have any access for our UI elements, so we don't update them. Currently, our poop counter and the best level counter are 0. And no matter what we do, they are always 0. So at first, let's access these elements and let's make a function for updating our poop currency. So in the game data section, I create a new element poop. This time, I'm using a let keyword because poop is a counter and we will change it in the future. Let's also create a variable for the best level. So then we have the HTML element section. So now inside of this section, let's access the corresponding HTML elements. Now I need to find this element in our HTML file. And now I see that inside of the B tag, we have the ID poop that contains the value of 0. This is exactly what we need to change when we update our poop currency. So let's copy this ID and let's paste it inside of this function. Now let's do the same for the best level. You can write the full name of this variable like best level element. I have very few space on my screen, so I need to have short and concise variables. Inside of our HTML element, I see the B tag with the ID of best level. So this is the variable that we need to change in our JavaScript. I paste the ID best level to this function, and now we can write a new function that will update our UI elements. Inside of the rendering section, we have the render function that updates our board, but we also need to update our counters right after the render function. Let's create a new function, update UI. So at first, let's change the text content of our poop currency. So we assign it to our global variable poop that stores how much currency we have in our JavaScript. And then let's do the same for the best level. So now let's check how this function works. And for that, let's change our global counters. So here I changed the poop value to 10 and the best level to 1. And now in the game start, right after our render, we need to call our update UI function. And now you see that our counters have been updated. Then let's create a function that will increase our poop by the level of our animal. I have the section helpers. So inside of this section, I can create a new function, increase poop. So this function needs to increase the global variable poop by a certain amount. So at first, let's increase it by 1. For that, I can write poop++. So this function will not return anything. And then we need to call this function when we click our animal. So in the rendering section, we access each cell from our board. If cell is not equal to null, it means that we have our pet. And now we want to attach a new trigger to this pet. So before we append our pet div to the cell div, let's add our trigger. For that, I have a method addEventListener that I can call for the pet div. This listener expects two values. The first value is the trigger itself. So when we need to call a specific function, I can write click. So it means that when I click this div, I need to call a specific function. Then I put comma, and now as the second parameter, I can pass a function that I want to execute. So we want to execute increase poop function. This is very important to pass this function without parentheses. In this case, the addEventListener will be able to execute this function. Currently, if I click our chick, nothing happens, and this is because inside of the increase poop function, we doesn't call update UI function. So here we need to call our update UI function because poop is just a counter inside of the JavaScript and our user doesn't see it. We need to update our HTML elements to see any change on this page. So I call this function, and now if you try to click our chick, you will see that the counter increases by 1. Let's return back to our trigger. So here, if I add parentheses right after increase poop, you will see that our counter is increased by 1, but then our trigger doesn't work. Because parenthesis means execution of this function. So it is executed once and then we can't execute it again. This is the reason why I need to remove this parenthesis and why I need to pass this function as a parameter. In this case, our event listener can call it. So now it seems that this function works, but as I said, we doesn't need to increase our counter by 1, we need to increase it by the level of our animal. We have an array pets that contains all the data about all the possible animals. Currently, all these objects don't have the level and the reward that you get if you click this animal. So let's add these attributes. So now I extended our array. Each animal inside of this array has its own level and the reward. So now you can see that the last animal, unicorn, has the level of 10 and the reward of 55. And now we need to do in this way that our function increasePoop takes the reward of a specific animal that we click and then it increases our poop counter by this reward. At first, let's go to our increasePoop function. So here we need to pass a new parameter, which is reward. And now I can increase poop by this reward. For that, I write poop plus equal reward. So now let's click our animal. You will see that our counter have been changed to something strange. And this is because we don't pass the expected reward. But we don't have this variable yet, so let's create it. So before I create a new div, let's create a new variable reward. So currently I know that our object contains this data. Inside of our array pets, we have a new parameter reward with the value of 1. So it means that our cell data contains all these parameters and one of them is reward. So I know the specific name of this key and I can access it by writing celldata.reward. So now we pass it inside of our trigger. So let's test how it works. And now you see that our counter have been increased by 1, but if we click our animal, it doesn't work anymore. So here is the problem in this parenthesis. Previously, this function haven't asked any parameters. This was the reason why we could pass it without parenthesis. There is one problem. For passing a new parameter, we need to put parenthesis. But parenthesis execute this function immediately. So how to solve this problem? In JavaScript, we have anonymous functions. The syntax is very simple. I just need to add parentheses and then I need to write this arrow. And now if you try clicking our chick, you will see that our counter increases by the level of this chick. So if I go to pets array and if I change the reward to 10, now you will see that each click gives me 10 currency. So let's undo this change. So about this function, anonymous function has a lot of theory behind it, so why it works in this way and why it has this weird syntax. You will understand it with experience, but currently you just need to understand which problem it solves. So if we need to pass our function as a parameter, and if this function expects any parameters, we must put parentheses to write all the parameters that this function expects. But parentheses call the function immediately, and to prevent this behavior, we write the anonymous function. So this function doesn't have any name and it is used only on one line. Also, after our arrow, I can write curly braces. It will work absolutely the same, but now I can expand them. And now inside of the curly braces, I can have multiple lines. So let's call this function twice. So now the reward of our chick is 1, but if I click our chick, you will see that our counter increased by 2 because inside of this trigger, we call our function twice. Currently we don't need it, but you just know that you can put many lines inside of anonymous function. So if you have just one line as we have, you don't even need these curly braces. So we have finished with our animal, but our buy button still doesn't work. So let's implement it. Let's think what we want when we click our buy pet button. We want to generate a new animal on our board. We will have a function spawn new pet. So at first, let's call this function every time when user clicks the buy button. Our button is an HTML element. At first, let's access this element inside of our JavaScript. I found this element inside of our HTML, so let's copy this ID and now I can pass it inside of our function. If you don't understand my variable name, you can call it buy button element. So then we need to write a new trigger that every time when we click our buy button, we spawn a new animal. Now we have section triggers inside of our render function, but there is one difference. So render function is responsible for our board. It represents our board from the variable that we have in our JavaScript. and then we attach all these triggers to this board. But our buy button is a constant HTML element that is outside of our board. So let's create a new section triggers before the game start for constant elements. And now we can attach our click trigger. So our spawn new pet function doesn't require any parameters, and it means that we can just pass this function without parentheses. So now let's test how it works. If I click our buy button, nothing will change, and this is because inside of our spawn new pet function, we doesn't call the render function that will update the board of our page. So here, let's call the render function. And now, if you save this file, you will see that something weird happens because we have 2 times more elements on our board. And if you click the buy button, you will see more cells on our board. And this is because our render function creates new cells, but it doesn't remove the old cells. So every time before we generate new cells, we need to clear our board. You see that we append all our cells to the board element. So it means that we need to clear this board element before we append new children. For that, in the beginning of this function, I can write board element.innerHTML, which is equal to empty string. Inside of the HTML file, find the div with the ID grid. So this is our board. And what innerHTML means, it means all the content that is inside of our grid. So for example, we have many divs inside of this grid, and then if you call innerHTML, which is equal to empty string, it takes all these divs and removes them. So simply, it removes all the elements, and it means that we start from the new board when we call this function. In JavaScript, we have a variable board and we store all the data inside of this variable. And you need to understand that we actually don't remove the data from this variable. We just remove the previous state of our HTML board. So actually we don't lose any data, we just clear it before generating new board. And now if you click buy button, you will see that it generates a new animal on our board. Currently, our users can click this button as much as they want. So actually, we need to check that our user has enough currency for buying a new animal, and then we need to subtract this cost from the total currency that our user has. So for that, let's change our spawn new pet function. In the beginning, let's add a new section, validation. And the first check that we will do is that our user has enough currency. For that, I can write that our poop is more or equal to 10. If I use the hard-coded value 10, it means that I can change the cost of our pets. So if you want to change this cost every time when user buy a new pet, so to make the progression that each next pet costs more and more, you need to create a new variable where you will store the pet cost, and then you need to create a function that will increase this variable every time when you call it. But for the simplicity, we stay with the constant price. So every time our pet's price will be 10. And this is the reason why I can just use this 10 without making a new variable for that. So, and now if our user has enough poop, we can create a new pet and then we can put it on our board. But actually, here we have one problem. What if we will have several checks? Every time when I add a new if statement, our data goes further and further, and it becomes difficult to read. So, and for preventing it, let's undo our changes. And actually, in the validation, we need to check the negative outcome. So in our case, what if our poop is less than 10? In this case, we need to show some kind of error, and then we need to stop our function. So for showing an error, we can use alert function that will generate a new pop-up for our user. For that, I call the function alert, and now inside of this function, I can write a message that I will show to our user. So I will write the message that you don't have enough poop, and then for stopping this function, I can write the keyword return. Now let's test how it works. So at first I will change our poop to 1, and then you will immediately see a pop-up with the message that you don't have enough poop. And this is because in the game start, we call our function spawn new pet immediately. So actually it means that our function works correctly, because as you see, we haven't spawned a new animal. So I return back our poop to 10, and now let's click our button again. So you see that we buy a new pet, but our counter remains the same. So we need to subtract the cost from our counter. So before we call the render function, let's decrease our poop by 10. Now you see that we start our game with one pet on the map and with 0 currency. And if I click buy new pet, you will see the message that you don't have enough poop and nothing will change. So it means that our function works correctly. Currently you might think that we have implemented the buy button, but actually there are a few mistakes and edge cases that we need to take into account. Let's increase the initial poop counter to 1000 so we can generate animals easily. And the first problem that you will see that if you buy a new animal, our counter remains the same. And this is because inside of our spawn new pet function, we call the render function that updates our board. But we don't call update UI function that updates our UI elements. So let's call it. Now let's click this button again. So currently we decrease the right amount of currency, but there are still other problems. For example, what if our board is full? In this case, if you click our buy button, you will see that our counter decreases, but a new animal haven't been generated. And this is because our board is full. But what we actually want to show, we want to show to our user that the board is full, so you can't create a new animal. So let's create a new validation that will check that our board is full. For that, I will create a new variable board is full and the default value will be true. So I imply that the board is full in the beginning. And then we need to write a for loop that will go through each cell and check if there is at least one empty cell or not. Here I create the same variable as in our render function, and now we can check if the cell data is equal to null. We can set our board is full variable to be false. If at least one cell is null, it means that our board is not full, so we can buy a new animal. Here I also can write the keyword break. So as we reach this keyword, we stop the execution of our loop. Even if you remove this keyword, you will not see any visual changes, but if you think how it works, when you don't have the keyword break, it means that your for loop goes through an entire board. But actually, if the first cell is null, we set our board is full variable to false, and then there are no sense for continuing this loop. So just for better efficiency, we can add this keyword. And now, after our for loop, we can check that if our board is full, we need to show an error and then we need to stop the function. I can use the same alert function as in our first validation, but I will just change the content of this message. So for example, I can write that board is full and then I write the return keyword to finish this function. Now let's test how it works. Currently, I have a full board, and if I try to buy a new animal, you see a message that board is full. And then you see that our counter remains the same. But there is still one problem that you might notice. If we have many pets and if we want to buy a new one, we need to press the buy button many times. And this is because we have the index overlap. So currently we generate a random index between 0 until the board length. So for example, instead of calling this function, let's put 0. So now all the time our chick is generated on the first cell. And then no matter how much I click this button, there will not be new animals. If two animals have the same index, a new one just overwrites the previous one. Actually, when we call our generate pet index, we want to check that this index is unique. The easiest way to check it is to write a while loop that will check that if the cell with a newly generated index contains a pet, it means that we need to generate a new index. But before writing a while loop, be sure that you wrote the second validation about board is full. Every time when you write a while loop, you need to think, can there be an infinite loop or not? So currently, we want to check that our index is unique. But what happens if our board is full? If our board is full, it means that we don't have any free cells. There are no new index that we can generate. So currently we wrote the validation about the board is full, and it means that we safely can write a while loop. So after we created our index, let's check that if our board with the current index is not equal to null, it means that it contains an animal. We will generate a new index. And now we need to change the keyword const to the keyword let, because we want to reassign the same variable. And now let's test how it works. So currently on my map, I have only one cell, and if I click buy new animal, we should spawn a new animal exactly on this cell. We see a new animal and we also see that our counter have been updated, so it means that we have implemented our buy button. Eventually, our spawn new pet function became much more complex than we expected, but this is very common in programming. All the time you need to think about edge cases. What if user behaves not as you expect? In the next video, we will create merge buttons for merging our animals into a new animal of the next level.